The Arizona sun did not shine upon the town of Red Butte. It hammered it. It was a relentless, white-hot force that bleached the color from the wooden boardwalks and turned the surrounding earth into a fine, choking powder that tasted of iron and dried blood. It was the kind of heat that made a man mean and a woman tired before the day had even properly begun. Eliza Kane walked her mule, Betsy, down the center of the main street, keeping her head lowered. The brim of her bonnet was pulled low, and a thick cotton scarf was wrapped high around her neck, despite the temperature climbing past 90 degrees. To the casual observer, she might have looked like a woman protecting her complexion from the harsh elements. To the people of Red Butte, she was a walking cautionary tale. She was 25 years old, an age when most women in the territory were bouncing a second or third child on their hip and worrying about the price of flour. Eliza had no children. She had no husband. She had only the mule, a small shack 3 miles out of town where the desert scrub met the foothills. And the scar. The scar defined her. It claimed the left side of her face, dragging the corner of her lip downward in a perpetual, frozen grimace, and melted the skin of her cheek into a map of ridged, shiny flesh that disappeared beneath her collar. It was the souvenir of a fire that had taken everything else she owned 3 years ago. "Look, Mama!" A child's voice piped up from the shade of the mercantile porch. "It is the scorched girl." "Hush now," the mother hissed, grabbing the boy by the shoulder and pulling him behind her ample skirts. "Don't you look at her. It is bad luck to stare at something God turned his back on." Eliza heard them. She always heard them. The nickname had started in the saloon and spread to the schoolyard within a month of her leaving the clinic. Scorched girl. It sounded like something less than human. A piece of burnt wood. A ruined thing. She kept her eyes on the dust kicking up around her boots. She had learned that if she did not look at them, she did not have to see the mixture of pity and revulsion in their eyes. Pity she could handle. It was the revulsion that made her stomach turn over. It confirmed what she told herself every morning when she accidentally caught her reflection in the water bucket. She was a monster. She was unlovable. She tethered Betsy to the hitching rail outside the general store. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she steadied them against the rough wood. She needed supplies, coffee, beans, a small sack of sugar if she could afford it. She reached into her pocket and fingered the few coins she had earned from mending shirts for the few miners who didn't care who held the needle. As long as the tear was fixed, inside, the store smelled of sawdust, pickled eggs, and tobacco. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, weighing out nails for a farmer. When Eliza stepped in, the low hum of conversation near the stove died out instantly. It was a silence loud enough to ring in her ears. "Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, not meeting her eyes. "Miss Kane, what can I do for you today?" "Just the usual, Mr. Henderson," Eliza said, her voice soft. She hated how breathy it sounded, as if she were apologizing for her existence. "And maybe a pound of sugar," while the shopkeeper moved to fetch the items. Eliza felt the eyes of the 2 men by the stove boring into her back. She knew them. Everyone knew everyone in Red Butte. One was a ranch hand for the Bar H, Bart Hollister's massive outfit. The other was a drifter who had been hanging around for a month. "Say," the drifter whispered, loudly enough to be heard, "that the one Rourke talks about, the one that burned her own daddy alive." Eliza froze. Her hand went instinctively to the scarf at her neck, tightening it. "That is her," the ranch hand replied with a sneer. "Crazy as a coyote that ate poison weed. Set the barn on fire in a fit of rage, is what the deputy says. Burned her face off trying to get out, but left the old man to roast. It took every ounce of will Eliza possessed not to turn around and scream, 'Liar.' The word echoed in her skull. Liar, liar, liar. But she said nothing. She knew the rules of Red Butte. The truth did not matter here. What mattered was who told the story. And Clay Rourke had a badge, a loud voice, and the backing of the richest man in the territory. Eliza Kane was just a woman with a ruined face and a dead father. She placed her coins on the counter. "Mr." Henderson scooped them up quickly. as if afraid the bad luck might rub off on his skin. He slid the sack of beans and the packet of coffee toward her. "I am out of sugar." He lied. She could see the barrel behind him, full to the brim. "Thank you," she said, taking her goods. She walked out, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the hollow ache in her chest. The heat outside seemed to have intensified. Eliza secured her packages to Betsy's saddle. She wanted to mount up and ride hard until the town was just a smudge on the horizon. But she had to check the cinch. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," and then spit back out because it tasted burnt. The voice was like oil slicked over gravel. Eliza's blood ran cold. She did not have to turn around to know that Clay Rourke was standing on the boardwalk outside the Golden Steer Saloon. Just 3 doors down. She continued to fumble with the saddle strap, her fingers numb. "I am talking to you." "Eliza," Clay said, his boots thumping heavy on the wooden planks as he approached. She turned slowly. Clay Rourke had not changed much in 3 years, though his waist had thickened and his face was ruddier from whiskey and sun. He wore the tin star of a deputy marshal pinned to his vest, catching the glare of the sun. It was the ultimate joke of the territory that a man like Clay was charged with keeping the peace. He stopped 5 feet from her, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was smiling, but it was a smile that never reached his eyes. "You look hot, darlin'," he drawled. "Why don't you take that scarf off? Let the boys see what you are hiding. Maybe scare the drunkenness out of old Pete over there." A few men on the saloon porch laughed. It was a nervous, sycophantic laughter. They laughed because Clay was dangerous, and because Bart Hollister owned the saloon. And Clay was Bart's dog. "Leave me alone, Clay," Eliza said. She was proud that her voice did not shake, though her knees felt like water. "Leave you alone." Clay stepped closer, invading her space. He smelled of stale beer and sweat. "I am just being neighborly, checking on the citizens, making sure you haven't decided to light any more fires." The memory hit her then. A physical blow. 3 years ago, a cool November night, the barn smelled of sweet hay. Clay had been drinking since noon. He had come demanding money, demanding she sell the broodmare so he could pay a gambling debt. Her father had stood in his way. The argument had turned into shouting. Eliza had tried to pull Clay back, begging him to go home and sleep it off. He had shoved her hard against the stall door. Then he had picked up the kerosene lantern. "You think you are better than me," he had screamed. "You and this old man think you are better than me." He threw the lantern, not on the ground, at the hayloft. The whoosh of ignition was a sound Eliza would hear in her nightmares until the day she died. The fire moved faster than thought. Her father had run in to get the horses out. Eliza had run in to get her father. A falling beam, the smell of burning hair, the searing agony on her face. And Clay stood outside, watching, his face pale in the firelight. Before he turned and ran into the darkness, Eliza blinked, forcing the memory back into the box she kept locked in her mind. She looked up at Clay now. "You know what happened," she whispered. Clay's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed into hard slits. He leaned in so close his breath stirred the loose strands of hair by her ear. "I know what the judge wrote down," he hissed low, so only she could hear. "Accidental fire caused by negligence. And I know what people believe. You think anyone is going to take the word of a scarred-up, hysterical woman over a lawman? You are nothing. Eliza, you are just a piece of trash that didn't burn all the way." He stepped back, his voice booming again for the benefit of the audience. "You get on home now, before you scare the horses." Eliza met Betsy. She did not look back as she kicked the mule into a trot. She felt the tears pricking her eyes, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. The ride back to her shack took her past the edge of the Hollister ranch. It was a sprawling empire of barbed wire and thirsty cattle. Bart Hollister was a man who looked at the horizon and saw only profit. He had arrived 10 years ago with a satchel of money and a ruthlessness that frightened even the hardened locals. Now, he owned half the valley. Eliza saw 2 riders near the fence line, One was Hollister himself, a large man in a dark suit who sat on his horse like a king. He was gesturing toward the purple peaks of the Dragoon Mountains in the distance. Those mountains were Apache land. The town of Red Butte existed in a state of perpetual, low-grade terror regarding the Apache. Every stolen cow, every dry well, every child who wandered off and got lost was blamed on the savages in the hills. They are monsters. Mrs. Gable at the bakery had told Eliza once, "They steal women and eat babies. That chief of theirs, Nantan, I heard he wears a necklace made of human fingers." Eliza had shivered then. She had grown up hearing the stories. The Apache were the bogeymen of the West. If you were not good, the Apache would get you. If you stayed out too late, the Apache would get you. But as she rode past the Hollister fence, she heard a snippet of conversation carried on the dry wind. "Water rights are crucial, Bart," a man was saying. "But the Army treaty says that land belongs to Nantan's group. Treaties are paper." Bart Hollister's voice boomed, deep and resonant. "Cattle need water, and progress needs land. If the savages won't move, we will have to give the Army a reason to move them." Eliza urged Betsy faster. She did not want to hear this. She did not want to know about politics or land wars. She just wanted to be safe inside her four walls. But the world felt like it was closing in on her. On one side, the town that mocked her and the man who had ruined her life. On the other, the mountains filled with warriors who, if the stories were true, would kill her as soon as they saw her. She felt trapped, a small, insignificant thing caught between a hammer and a hard place. Her shack was a humble structure of rough-hewn logs and mud chinking, with a tin roof that sang when the rain finally came. It sat in the shadow of a small mesa, isolated from the rest of the world. Eliza stabled Betsy and fed her the last of the oats. She went inside and barred the door. Only then did she unwind the scarf. The air in the cabin was stifling, but she lit a small fire in the stove anyway to boil coffee. She caught her reflection in the dark window pane. The left side of her neck was a tapestry of thick, pink keloid scars that pulled the skin tight. The ear on that side was misshapen. The lobe melted away. The cheek was a swirl of discoloration. She touched the skin. It had no feeling on the surface, yet it ached deep down when the weather changed. "Ugly," she whispered to the empty room. She sat at her small table, sipping the black coffee. It was bitter, but the heat of it was grounding. She looked around at her life, a single bed, a stove, a shelf of books her father had saved, a rifle she barely knew how to use hanging over the door. She was surviving. She had rebuilt the shack with her own hands after the fire. She grew vegetables in a small patch out back. She took in washing and mending. She was independent, but she was also hollow. Clay Rourke was right about one thing. She thought bitterly. She was a ghost. She haunted the edges of Red Butte, a reminder of a tragedy everyone wanted to forget. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled around the corners of the shack, sounding like voices. Eliza went to the window and looked out toward the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The Dragoon Mountains were black silhouettes against the light. Somewhere up there was Nantan, the bloodthirsty chieftain, the monster. "He probably has a better life than I do," she murmured. "At least he had people. At least he had a house that he fought for." She thought about Hollister's words. Give the Army a reason to move them. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled over her. Trouble was coming. She could feel it in the air, electric and heavy like a storm before the lightning strikes. And when trouble came to Red Butte, it usually found the people who could not fight back. She finished her coffee and blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark, her hand resting on the scar, waiting for sleep that would inevitably be filled with the sound of breaking glass and the roar of flames. The desert night was vast and indifferent. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, wavering sound. Eliza Kane closed her eyes and prayed for a dreamless night, unaware that her quiet, scorched life was about to be set on fire again. But this time, the heat would come from a very different source. The job came from Mr. Henderson, the same man who had pretended to be out of sugar 3 days prior. He needed 20 gallons of kerosene transported from the depot on the far side of the ridge to the railway station, a journey of 10 miles through rough country. The regular hauler had taken ill with a fever. Or perhaps he simply had better things to do than drag volatile fuel under the punishing Arizona sun. Eliza accepted the offer without hesitation. The pay was $2, enough to buy flour, coffee, and perhaps a small bag of grain for Betsy. It was heavy, dirty work, the kind usually reserved for men with strong backs and empty heads. But Eliza had learned long ago that pride was a luxury she could not afford. The afternoon sun was a heavy weight on her shoulders as she guided the buckboard wagon through the scrubland. The barrels of kerosene rattled in the back, sloshing rhythmically. The smell of the oil was sharp and pungent, cutting through the dusty heat. It made her nose twitch, a scent too close to the memory of the fire that had taken her face. But she forced herself to breathe it in. Fear was just another stone in her shoe. She had to walk on it to get anywhere. She took the old mining road that cut through Serpentine Gorge. It was a narrow, twisting path flanked by towering walls of red sandstone that trapped the heat and held it close. Few people used this road anymore, preferring the wider, safer road that circled the foothills. Eliza chose it precisely because it was empty. Here, she did not have to lower her head. Here, she was just a woman driving a wagon, not a spectacle. Halfway through the gorge, the path narrowed near a cluster of fallen boulders. Eliza pulled on the reins to let Betsy rest in the slice of shade provided by the overhang. The silence of the canyon was profound, broken only by the panting of the mule and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, she heard voices. They drifted down from a shelf of rock just above the bend in the road, carried by the peculiar acoustics of the canyon. "Are you sure the wind will hold?" The voice was unmistakable. It was deep, resonant, and carried the arrogance of a man who owned everything he saw. Bart Hollister. Eliza froze. Her hands tightened on the leather reins until her knuckles turned white. She knew she should flick the reins and move on, but a cold knot of dread anchored her to the spot. "The wind always blows north this time of year. Bart, by the time anyone smells smoke, the whole depot will be nothing but ash." The second voice was lighter, slurred slightly, like oil sliding over a whetstone. "Clay Rourke." Eliza held her breath. She carefully tied the reins to the brake lever and slipped from the wagon seat, moving as silently as a ghost toward the shelter of a large mesquite bush near the canyon wall. She needed to know. "Good," Hollister said. She could hear the strike of a match, the smell of cigar smoke drifting down to mix with the kerosene fumes. "Once the town's supply is gone, the settlers will panic. Without fuel for the winter and with the fear of the dark, they will be desperate. I will offer 5 cents on the acre for the valley lots. They will beg me to take them." "And the blame?" Clay asked. There was a sickening excitement in his tone. "The Apache, of course," Hollister replied smoothly. "We leave a few arrows, maybe scalp a stray dog and leave it near the ashes. The army is already itching for a fight. Captain Miller just needs a reason to clear those mountains. We give him one. We burn the depot, blame Nantan's band, and watch the cavalry wipe them out. Then the water rights, the timber, the copper. It is all ours." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. It was not just greed. It was a massacre in the making. They were planning to starve the town and slaughter the tribe, all to expand a cattle empire. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a gasp. The sheer scale of the evil made her dizzy. Clay, the man who had burned her father alive in a drunken rage, was now planning to burn an entire town's livelihood and ignite a war. She had to leave. She had to get back to town, find the doctor, find the judge, find anyone who would listen, even if they hated her. Surely they would not let their homes burn. She took a step back, her eyes fixed on the ridge where the smoke curled up. Her boot heel came down on a patch of loose shale. Click-clack. The sound was sharp, echoing off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Above her, the conversation stopped instantly. "What was that?" Clay's voice snapped, stripped of its casual cruelty, replaced by the alertness of a predator. Eliza scrambled back toward the wagon. She did not care about silence anymore. She grabbed the reins, hauling herself up onto the seat. "Hey!" Clay yelled from the ridge. "Someone is down there!" Eliza slapped the reins hard. "Hiya, go! Betsy, go!" The mule, startled by the sudden violence in her mistress's voice, surged forward. The wagon jerked, the kerosene barrels slamming against the wood. "It is the girl!" Clay shouted. Eliza glanced back just long enough to see him standing on the edge of the cliff, peering down. "It is the scorched girl. She heard us!" Hollister roared. His voice was a thunderclap in the narrow space. "Do not let her get away. Clay, if she talks, the deal is dead. Kill her. She is bad luck anyway. Finish it." Eliza whipped the reins. The wagon careened down the rocky path, bouncing wildly. She had a head start, but she was in a heavy wagon, and they were on horseback. She could hear the thunder of hooves on the ridge path above, cutting down to intercept her. "Come on, Betsy!" she screamed, the wind tearing the bonnet from her head. Her scar burned in the sun, exposed and raw. A gunshot cracked the air. A puff of dust exploded near the front wheel. They were shooting at her. They were actually going to kill her. Eliza drove the mule harder than she had ever driven an animal in her life. The wagon skidded around a sharp turn, two wheels lifting off the ground before slamming back down with a bone-jarring thud. Another shot rang out. This time, she felt a sudden, sharp sting in her left shoulder, like a hot brand pressing against the flesh. She cried out, nearly dropping the reins. Warm blood began to soak through her sleeve immediately. "I have the range!" Clay shouted from somewhere behind her. He was gaining. "Pull up! Eliza, make it quick!" She did not pull up. She steered the wagon toward a narrow split in the canyon wall, a dry wash that was too tight for the wagon but might fit the mule if she cut it loose. But there was no time. The wagon hit a large rock hidden in the dust. The front axle shattered with a sound like a screaming tree branch. The buckboard pitched violently to the right. Eliza was thrown clear. She flew through the air, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of red rock and blue sky, before she slammed into the hard earth of the dry wash. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She rolled, tumbling down the slope of the ravine, gravel tearing at her dress and skin, until she came to a stop at the bottom, wedged between two boulders. For a moment, there was only a high-pitched ringing in her ears and the throbbing agony in her shoulder. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like lead. She looked up. Clay Rourke appeared at the lip of the ravine, 20 feet above her. He sat high on his horse, his pistol smoking in his hand. He looked down at her with a look of utter contempt. "You just do not know when to die, do you? Eliza!" he called down. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. The click was loud in the sudden silence. Eliza pressed herself back against the rock. She had no weapon. She had no escape. This was it. The fire had missed her 3 years ago. But the bullet would not miss today. She closed her eyes, waiting for the flash. Thwip! It was a soft sound, almost like a bird taking flight. Then a wet thud. "Gah!" Clay screamed, his gun going off wildly into the air. Eliza's eyes snapped open. An arrow was quivering in the ground, inches from Clay's boot. A second arrow struck the saddle horn of his horse, causing the animal to rear violently. Clay fought to control his mount, his face twisting from arrogance to panic. "Apache!" he shrieked. "Bart! It is an ambush!" On the ridge above Clay, silhouettes appeared. They did not look like men. They looked like spirits carved from the mountain itself. They sat on painted ponies, motionless, their bows drawn. Bart Hollister rode up beside Clay, his face red with fury. He looked at the warriors on the ridge, then down at Eliza, then back at the arrows. He knew the odds. "Pull back!" Bart yelled. He glared down at Eliza one last time, his eyes promising a slow death if they ever met again. "See, I told you, bloodthirsty savages, they are protecting her, let us go." Clay fired 2 more shots blindly toward the ridge, then spurred his horse around. The 2 men galloped away, their dust cloud mingling with the smoke of the pistols, shouting warnings of an Apache war party to anyone who might be listening. Silence returned to the canyon. heavier than before. Eliza lay still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Were they gone, or was she now the prize of the war party? She tried to sit up, but the world tilted alarmingly. Her shoulder was throbbing with a sickening rhythm. She watched the ridge. One of the riders descended. He did not rush. He guided his horse down the steep shale slope with a fluid, easy grace that made horse and rider seem like a single creature. Eliza shrank back against the stone. She had heard the stories. She knew what they did to white women. Torture, slavery, things worse than death. She groped around on the ground for a rock, her fingers trembling. The rider reached the bottom of the ravine and dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing buckskin leggings and a simple cotton shirt that had seen much wear. His hair was long and black, held back by a strip of red cloth. He carried no rifle, only a bow slung over his shoulder and a knife at his belt. He walked toward her. His steps were silent. "Stay back," Eliza rasped. Her voice was weak, pathetic. She raised the fist-sized rock she had found. I will kill you." The warrior stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the rock in her hand, then up at her face. He did not look at the blood on her shoulder. He looked straight at the scar. His eyes were the darkest thing Eliza had ever seen. Yet they held no malice. There was no mockery in them, no disgust, just calm, assessing intensity. This was Nantan. It had to be. The monster of Red Butte. He said something in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones. It was guttural, but soft. Eliza did not understand, but she lowered the rock slightly. He stepped closer. Eliza flinched, bracing for the blow. Instead, he knelt. He reached out a hand not to strike, but to gesture toward her shoulder. The blood was soaking the front of her dress now, dark and sticky. "You are hurt," he said. The English words were heavily accented, the vowels long and flat, but they were clear. Eliza stared at him, stunned. You speak English." "I speak enough," he said. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet canyon. "They missed your heart, but the bleeding must stop." He reached for the scarf that she had wrapped around her neck to hide her scars. Eliza's hand flew up to stop him. "No, do not look at it." Nantan paused. His hand hovered in the air. He looked at her panic, at the way she tried to hide the ruined half of her face, even while bleeding from a gunshot wound. "The cloth," he said gently. "I need it to bind the arm. Unless you want to bleed into the sand." Eliza hesitated. Her head was swimming. The edges of her vision were turning gray. She slowly lowered her hand. Nantan unwound the scarf. As the fabric fell away, revealing the melted flesh of her neck and cheek to the harsh sunlight, Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the intake of breath. The recoil, the sound of disgust. It never came. She felt firm, warm fingers pressing a pad of folded cloth against the bullet wound. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had seen many wounds. He took the scarf and wrapped it tightly around her shoulder, securing the pressure pad. "Open your eyes," he commanded. It was not a request. Eliza opened them. Nantan was inches from her face. He was looking at the scar. He was studying it, not as a deformity, but as a fact. "Fire," he stated. "Yes," Eliza whispered. "Fire takes," Nantan said, tying the knot of the bandage. "But fire also leaves behind what is strong enough to not burn." He sat back on his heels. "Those men, they called you a name." "Scorched girl," Eliza said, the shame rising in her throat. "A foolish name," Nantan said. He stood up and offered her his hand. It was calloused, the skin the color of deep copper. "Can you ride? Your wagon is broken." "My mule. My brother has caught the mule. It is safe." Eliza looked at his hand. It was the hand of the enemy, the hand of the savage. Yet it was the only hand that had been extended to her in 3 years without demanding something in return or trembling with revulsion. She realized then that Clay and Bart had left her to rot. They had seen her as refuse. This man saw her as something else. She reached up and took his hand. His grip was iron strong. pulling her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Where are you taking me?" she asked, swaying slightly as the dizziness returned. "The town is not safe for you," Nantan said, steadying her by the elbow. "Those men will come back to see if you are dead. You come to the high places, to the stronghold." "Your village?" Eliza asked, fear spiking again. "But I am white." Nantan looked toward the ridge where the dust of the fleeing men had settled. His expression was unreadable, ancient and sad. "White is just a color of skin," he said. "Enemy is a condition of the heart. You are not my enemy today." He whistled, and his horse trotted over. He helped her mount behind him. Eliza hesitated, then wrapped her good arm around his waist. He smelled of sagebrush, leather, and wood smoke. As they began the climb up the narrow trail leading away from the canyon floor, Eliza looked back at the wreckage of her wagon, her life in Red Butte, her lonely shack, her buckets of water. Her hiding in the shadows lay shattered down there. She was riding into the mountains with the bogeyman, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not feel like she was the one being hunted. The twist turned in her mind as the horse picked its way over the stones. She had been taught that civilization was in the town, and savagery was in the hills. But down in the canyon, civilization had tried to put a bullet in her back. Savagery had just bound her wound and offered her a ride. "Hold on," Nantan said over his shoulder. "The path is steep." Eliza held on. She leaned her forehead against his back, too exhausted to keep it up, and let the rocking motion of the horse carry her away from the world of men and into the sky. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting the world into shadow. But up ahead, the peaks were still glowing with the last light of day. The air grew thinner and sharper as the horse climbed, trading the suffocating dust of the lowlands for the scent of pine resin and crushed juniper. Eliza Kane clung to Nantan's waist, her eyes squeezed shut against the vertigo induced by the sheer drop-offs along the trail. They had been riding for what felt like hours, ascending a path so narrow and treacherous that a single misstep would send them plummeting into the rocky abyss below. When the horse finally leveled out, Eliza dared to open her eyes. She gasped softly. They had passed through a natural stone archway that effectively hid the plateau from the valley floor below. Spread out before her, nestled in a bowl of granite and protected by towering cliffs on 3 sides, lay the Apache stronghold. It was not the chaotic den of savages she had been warned about in the terrified whispers of Red Butte. It was a village. Wickiup's domed shelters made of brush and hides were arranged in rough concentric circles. Smoke curled lazily from central fire pits, carrying the savory aroma of roasting meat. Children with skin the color of copper ran barefoot across the packed earth, their laughter rising into the cool mountain air like sparks. Near the stream that cut through the center of the camp, women were grinding corn or weaving baskets with practiced, rhythmic movements. Men sat in small groups, fletching arrows or repairing tack, their voices low and steady. As Nantan guided the horse into the perimeter of the camp, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The laughter of the children died out. The rhythmic grinding of corn stopped, one by one. Heads turned. Dozens of pairs of dark eyes fixed on the white woman seated behind their war chief. Eliza shrank against Nantan's back, her heart resuming its frantic hammering against her ribs. She felt like a trespasser, a ghost who had wandered into the land of the living, unwanted and feared. A tall, broad-chested warrior with a scar running through his eyebrow stepped forward to block their path. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, but his grip tightened as he looked from Nantan to Eliza. He spoke sharply in his native tongue, his tone accusatory. Eliza did not need to know the language to understand the hostility. She saw the way the other villagers gathered, their faces hard masks of suspicion. She heard the murmurs rippling through the crowd like a dry wind. Nantan stopped the horse but did not dismount. He answered the warrior in a calm, resonant voice. The 2 men exchanged words for a long moment. The tall warrior pointed a finger at Eliza, then gestured violently toward the valley below, miming the arrival of soldiers. They think I am a spy. Eliza realized with a jolt of terror. They think I will lead the cavalry here. Nantan shook his head. He turned slightly, reaching back to grip Eliza's uninjured arm, not roughly, but with a firmness that claimed her presence. He spoke again to the crowd, his voice carrying over the wind. He used a few English words mixed in with the Apache, perhaps for her benefit, or perhaps because there were no words in his language for the specific madness of the white men below. Hunted, Nantan said, his voice cutting through the tension. Wolf does not bring the hunter. Wolf runs from the trap. She is the same. He dismounted and reached up to help her down. Eliza's legs were jelly. As her boots touched the ground, she stumbled. The tall warrior took a threatening step forward, but Nantan placed himself between them. He looked at his people, his gaze sweeping the circle. White skin, Nantan said, switching to English as he looked at Eliza, then translating for his people. But red blood. She bleeds as we bleed. Today, she is a guest. The tension did not vanish, but it held. The tall warrior spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and walked away. The circle dispersed slowly, though the wary glances remained. Nantan guided Eliza toward a wickiup near the center of the camp. Come, you must rest. Inside, the shelter was dim and smelled of earth and sage. Nantan gestured for her to sit on a pile of furs. Eliza sank down, her exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, throbbing roar. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was Nantan standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the fading light, watching over her not as a jailer, but as a guard. Eliza woke to the sensation of heat. For a terrifying second, she thought she was back in the barn, the flames licking at her skin. She sat up with a gasp, her hand flying to her face. It was not a fire. It was the morning sun filtering through the smoke hole in the roof of the wickiup. An older woman was kneeling beside her, applying a warm poultice to her shoulder. The woman had deep wrinkles etched into her face like river canyons. Her gray hair was tied back with a leather strip. Eliza flinched away, scrambling backward on the furs until her back hit the framework of the shelter. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, covering the left side of her face. The old woman made a clicking sound with her tongue, shaking her head. She did not look angry. She looked impatient. She gestured to the bowl of poultice, then to Eliza's shoulder. Eliza hesitated. Her shoulder felt stiff, but the burning pain was gone, replaced by a cool numbness. She slowly lowered the blanket, exposing the wound, but kept her face turned away, hiding the scar against her own shoulder. The flap of the wickiup pushed aside, and Nantan entered. He brought with him a bowl of steaming broth and a piece of flatbread. He looked at the old woman, who murmured something low, then looked at Eliza. My aunt says you are a difficult patient, Nantan said. There was no humor in his voice, just a dry observation. She says you move like a frightened rabbit. I'm sorry, Eliza whispered. She kept her head down, her hair falling forward to curtain her face. I did not mean to offend her. Eat, Nantan said, setting the food down on a flat stone beside her. Eliza was starving. She took the bowl, her hands trembling. It was a stew of rabbit and root vegetables, simple but rich. She ate quickly, conscious of Nantan watching her. When the old woman finished binding the fresh bandage, she gathered her supplies and left. Eliza was alone with the war chief. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. Eliza felt the weight of her scar like a physical burden. She knew he had seen it yesterday, but in the dim light of the shelter, the shame returned with full force. She adjusted her collar, trying to pull the fabric up. You hide it, Nantan said. He was sitting cross-legged across from her, his posture relaxed but alert. It is ugly, Eliza murmured, staring into her empty bowl. It scares people. It scares the people in the town, Nantan corrected, because they fear what they cannot control. Fire is wild. You survive the wild. That makes them feel small. Eliza looked up, surprised by the insight. They call me Scorched Girl. They say I'm cursed. Nantan leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. In this place, we have many scars. Look, He pulled up the sleeve of his shirt. A jagged white line ran from his elbow to his wrist. "Knife fight, Comancheros." He touched a puckered mark on his collarbone. "Bullet, blue coat soldier." He looked her in the eye. "We do not hide these things. A scar means the thing that tried to kill you failed. It is a victory mark. Here, you are not cursed. You are a survivor." Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. For 3 years, she had been told she was damaged goods. Now, this man, this supposed savage, was telling her she was victorious. It was too much to process. She looked away, blinking back tears. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping me? I am white. My people. They want you dead." Nantan's expression hardened. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold sorrow. "Yes, they want us dead. They want the land. They want the water. They want the gold they think is in the rocks." He picked up a small stick and poked at the embers of the small fire in the center of the shelter. "I had a wife, 2 sons. 3 winters ago, soldiers came while the men were hunting. When we returned," he snapped the stick in half. "They were gone." Eliza covered her mouth. I am so sorry." "I do not tell you for pity," Nantan said sternly. "I tell you so you know. I know what the white men are. I know Bart Hollister. I know the snake Clay Rourke." He looked at her intensely. "But I also know the eyes of a hunted animal. I saw it in you yesterday. You ran from them with the fear of death. A man does not kill his own kind unless there is a great evil between them. Tell me, why did they shoot you?" Eliza took a deep breath. She set the bowl down. She owed him this. She owed him the truth, even if it was dangerous. "I was delivering kerosene," she began, her voice gaining strength. "I stopped in the gorge to rest the mule. I heard them talking, Bart Hollister and Clay." She looked at Nantan, making sure he understood. "They are going to burn the depot, the town's fuel supply. They are going to do it tonight or tomorrow, when the wind is right." Nantan frowned. "Why burn their own supply?" "To scare the settlers," Eliza explained. "If the fuel is gone, people will be afraid of the winter. Bart thinks they will sell their land cheap. He wants the valley for his cattle." She paused, her hands clenching into fists. "But that is not all. They are going to blame you. They plan to leave arrows and parts of a dog at the fire, to make it look like an Apache raid. Bart said he wants to give the army a reason to come up here and clear you out." Nantan went very still. The air in the wickiup seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not shout. He did not rage. He became statue-like, a terrifying calmness settling over him. "He wants a war," Nantan said softly. "He burns his own nest to blame the hawk." "Yes," Eliza said. "I heard them. Then my horse kicked a stone. They saw me. They knew if I told anyone, their plan would fail. That is why they tried to kill me." Nantan stood up. He paced the small space of the shelter, his movements agitated now like a caged panther. "If the soldiers come, we will fight, but we are few. There are many guns, and they have cannons on wheels." He stopped and looked at Eliza. "You have brought me a heavy truth. Eliza Kane." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue. The vowels stretched, but it sounded respectful. "What will you do?" Eliza asked. "I must think," Nantan said. "Rest. Do not leave the circle of the fires. The young men are angry. They may not understand why you are here as I do." He turned and left the wickiup, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts. For the next 2 days, Eliza lived in a strange limbo. She was a prisoner who was free to walk, a guest who was feared. She stayed close to the wickiup as Nantan had ordered, watching the life of the village unfold. She saw things that chipped away at the wall of prejudice she had built up over a lifetime. She saw fathers teaching their sons to track lizards, laughing when the boys missed. She saw women gossiping as they worked hides, their laughter no different from the women in the sewing circle back in Red Butte, except these women did not stop and glare when Eliza looked at them. She began to help. It started small. She saw the old woman struggling to carry a heavy basket of wood. Without thinking, Eliza went to her and took the other handle. The woman had stiffened at first, her eyes wide. But when Eliza simply smiled and lifted, the woman nodded. They carried the wood together. That evening, the woman brought Eliza a piece of dried honeycomb. It was a silent peace offering. But the conflict within Eliza raged like a fever. Every hour she sat here safe was an hour Bart Hollister's plan moved forward. If the depot burned, people she knew, even people who had mocked her, would suffer. The baker who sold her stale bread at a discount, the blacksmith who never stared at her scar. They would freeze in the winter, and then the soldiers would come. And these people, the old woman with the honeycomb, the laughing children, would be slaughtered. She was the only witness. Her word against Hollister's was weak, but she had heard the details. She knew about the arrows. She knew about the specific lies they planned to tell. If she could get to the judge or the captain at the fort before the fire happened, maybe she could stop it. But to go back was suicide. Clay Rourke would finish the job this time. On the third afternoon, the oppression of her thoughts became too much. She needed to breathe. She needed to wash the dust of the journey and the smell of sickness from her skin. She asked the old woman, whose name she learned was Dasla, where she could bathe. Dasla pointed to a secluded pool further up the stream, fed by a small waterfall, sheltered by rocks. Eliza took a piece of soap she had in her pocket, one of the few things she had saved from the wagon wreckage, and walked to the pool. The water was ice cold and clear as glass. It reflected the blue sky and the towering pines perfectly. Eliza stripped off her dusty dress and chemise, shivering in the mountain air. She stepped into the water, gasping as the cold bit into her skin. She scrubbed herself furiously, trying to wash away the fear, the memory of the ambush, the feeling of Clay's eyes on her. She washed her hair, letting it float around her like a dark halo. Then, the water settled, the ripples smoothed out, and she saw herself. The reflection was merciless in the bright sunlight. The left side of her face was a landscape of twisted, shiny pink ridges. It pulled her eyes down. It ate into her hairline. It was a map of pain. For the first time since the fire, she did not have a mirror to turn away from. The water was everywhere. A sob broke from her chest. It was a harsh, ugly sound. She covered her face with her wet hands and wept. She cried for her father. She cried for the life she should have had. She cried because even here, amidst the beauty of the mountains, she was a monster. She did not hear the twigs snap. Tears do not wash away scars. Eliza, she gasped, plunging down into the water up to her neck. Turning to face the bank, Nantan was standing there. He had his back turned to her, looking out toward the trees, granting her modesty. "Go away," she choked out, her voice thick with misery. "Please, just go away." "I came to tell you we have seen riders in the valley," Nantan said, his voice calm and steady. He did not move to leave, "but I heard you weeping." "I am fine," Eliza lied, wiping her eyes furiously. "You are not fine," Nantan said. He turned his head slightly, not looking at her nakedness, but looking toward her direction. "You look at the water and you see the monster the white men created." "I see the truth," Eliza cried. "Look at me, I am hideous. No man could ever want this. No one could ever look at me and not see the fire." Nantan turned then. He kept his eyes strictly on her face, ignoring the water that swirled around her shoulders. His gaze was intense, piercing through her defenses. He walked to the edge of the water. He crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Come out," he said gently. "Wrap yourself. We must speak." Eliza hesitated, shivering. She grabbed her chemise and dress from the rock, scrambling onto the bank behind a large boulder to dress hurriedly. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons. When she stepped out, her hair dripping wet, she felt raw and exposed, even fully clothed. Nantan was still crouching by the water. He stood as she approached. "You say you see the fire," Nantan said. He stepped closer, entering her personal space. Eliza wanted to retreat, but his presence held her there. "I see it every day," she whispered. "That is because you look with the eyes of the past," Nantan said. He reached out. For a second, Eliza flinched, but he did not stop. His fingers, rough and warm, brushed against the unscarred side of her cheek, then moved across to the scarred side. He traced the ridge of the burn along her jawline. His touch was not a medical examination. It was a caress. Fire consumes, Nantan said slowly. It takes the wood and turns it to ash. It takes the flesh and turns it to spirit. But you are still here. He moved his thumb over the worst of the scarring. People in your town, they see the fire because they are afraid of being burned. But I have walked through fire too. I have walked through the fire of losing my blood, my land, my heart. He leaned in closer. His dark eyes locked onto hers. I do not see the fire. Eliza, I see the woman who walked through the fire and refused to become ash. I see the iron in your spine. I see the courage in your breath. Eliza stood frozen. Her heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to feel it through his fingertips. No one had touched her like this in 3 years. No one had looked at her with anything other than pity or disgust. But in Nantan's eyes, she saw something else. She saw recognition. He was a man made of scars, inside and out, and he recognized her as his kin. You really see that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I see it," Nantan said firmly. "And I see beauty. Not the beauty of a flower that wilts in a day, the beauty of the mountain that stands against the storm." He dropped his hand. The absence of his touch left her skin tingling. "Dry your hair," he said, his voice returning to its usual command. "The riders in the valley are Bart's men. They are scouting the passes. They know you are not dead. They are looking for me. They are looking for a way to finish what they started," Nantan said. "And if they do not find you, they will burn the depot sooner. We must decide. Eliza, do we run or do we fight?" Eliza looked at him. The shame that had crushed her moments ago in the water felt lighter now. It was not gone, but it was bearable. Nantan had looked at her scars and called them a mountain. She squared her shoulders. The pain in her wound flared, but she ignored it. "We cannot let them burn the town," she said. "And we cannot let them blame you." Nantan nodded slowly. A small, grim smile touched his lips. "Then we must go back into the fire, but this time, we brought the water." He turned to walk back toward the village. Eliza watched him for a moment. She touched her cheek where his fingers had been. For the first time in 3 years, she did not feel like the scorched girl. She felt like Eliza Kane, and Eliza Kane was furious. She hurried to catch up with him, her steps matching his stride on the pine needle floor. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. She had found a guide who could see in the dark. That night, the council of elders met around the central fire. Nantan spoke for a long time. He informed them of the plot. He informed them of the danger. There were arguments. Some wanted to move the camp deeper into the mountains. Some wanted to attack the town immediately. Eliza sat just outside the circle, listening to the cadence of their voices. Nantan translated for her later. "They are afraid," he said, sitting beside her as the fire died down. "But they trust me. We will send scouts. We will watch the depot. If Bart's men approach with torches, we will be there." "I have to go too," Eliza said. Nantan looked at her. "It is dangerous for you. Clay will kill you on sight." "I am the only witness," Eliza insisted. "If you stop the fire, they will just say you were attacking. I need to be there to tell the truth. I need to get the ledger I saw in Bart's office, the one he keeps his payments in." Nantan raised an eyebrow. "You saw a ledger?" "I saw him put it in his safe before he left." Eliza lied slightly. She hadn't seen the safe, but she knew Bart kept records. He was a businessman. He wouldn't pay a bribe without a receipt. "I can find proof." Nantan studied her face. "You have the spirit of a warrior," he said softly. "Very well. We will ride tomorrow at dusk. You will ride with me." He stood to leave, but paused. He looked down at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "Sleep well, Eliza," he said. "Good night, Nantan," she replied. As he walked away into the shadows, Eliza touched her face again. The scar was still there. The world was still dangerous, but the silence of the night no longer felt lonely. It felt like a held breath before a battle she was finally ready to fight. She pulled the fur blanket up to her chin and watched the sparks rise from the fire, drifting up to join the stars. For the first time, the fire did not look like destruction. It looked like warmth. The days that followed were not measured in hours, but in the ache of muscles and the sharpening of senses. Nantan did not treat Eliza as a guest to be coddled, nor as a prisoner to be guarded. He treated her as something far more demanding, a student who was running out of time. He took her up to the high ridges where the air was thin enough to make her lungs burn. He taught her how to move across the loose shale without sending a cascade of rocks clattering down to alert an enemy. He showed her how to hold a knife, not like a kitchen utensil, but like an extension of her own will. "You look with your eyes too much," Nantan said one afternoon. They were crouching in a thicket of scrub oak, watching a deer graze 50 yards away. Eliza had shifted her weight, and the dry leaves beneath her boots had crunched loud enough to make the deer's ears twitch. "I am trying to be quiet," Eliza whispered, frustrated. "You are trying to be silent," Nantan corrected, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Silence is empty. You must be part of the noise of the land. Listen to the wind. Listen to the squirrel. If you want to live, you must hear with your skin, with your bones, as we do. The white man walks heavy. He thinks the earth is a floor. The Apache walks light. We know the earth is a living back that can buck us off." Eliza wiped the sweat from her forehead. The scar on her neck pulled tight in the dry heat, a constant reminder of her frailty. But she nodded. She closed her eyes and tried to feel the vibration of the ground, the shift of the wind against her cheek. Slowly, the village began to change in her eyes. It was no longer a terrifying camp of strangers. It was a community. She began to see the individuals behind the paint and the feathers. She played cat's cradle with the children, using lengths of rawhide. She sat with the women, learning to grind mesquite beans into flour. Her most significant breakthrough came with the medicine. Her mother had been a midwife and a healer before the fever took her, and Eliza remembered the old ways of poultices and infusions. When a young boy cut his leg deep on a jagged rock, the wound began to fester. The village shaman was away on a spiritual quest, and the boy's mother was frantic. Eliza stepped forward. She asked for hot water and willow bark. She cleaned the wound with a tenderness that surprised the onlookers, then packed it with a paste she made from the bark and local honey. 2 days later, the fever broke, and the boy was limping but healing. The tall warrior who had spat at her arrival, whose name was Koche, stopped her by the fire that evening. He did not smile. He simply handed her a piece of roasted venison, the choicest cut. It was an apology. It was acceptance. But the peace was fragile. Scouts returned on the 4th day with grim news. They carried the severed head of a calf, branded with the mark of a neighboring rancher. "Shot with a rifle," Nantan observed, inspecting the wound at the base of the skull. "But look here." He pointed to a crude gash in the animal's flank where an arrow had been shoved in post-mortem. "They kill the cow with a gun, then stab it with Apache wood to tell a lie." "Bart is escalating," Eliza said, her stomach twisting. "He is creating the evidence he needs to call the cavalry." Later, they found boot prints near the sacred spring heavy, hobnailed boots that no Apache wore. The enemy was not just circling, they were probing. They were inside the perimeter. The council of elders met that night under a moon that looked like a curved blade. The argument was fierce. "We must leave," an elder named Goyakla argued, his voice shaking with rage. "We move south to the Sierra Madre. If we stay, the bluecoats will bring the cannons. If we run, we admit guilt," Nantan countered, his voice steady as a rock in a stream. "Bart Hollister wants this land. If we leave, he takes it, and he will hunt us wherever we go. A wolf does not outrun its shadow." "Then we fight," Kochi shouted, raising his fist. "We go down tonight. We burn the town before they burn the depot." "No," Eliza's voice rang out. The circle fell silent. It was forbidden for a woman, and an outsider, to speak in the war council, but fear gave her a desperate courage. She stepped into the light of the fire. "If you attack the town, you give them exactly what they want. They will say you are savages. They will say you struck first. Bart Hollister has a plan, and he has a ledger. I heard him. He pays men to do this. If we can prove he is paying mercenaries to burn his own town, the army will not attack you. They will arrest him." "And who will get this proof?" Goyakla sneered. "You, the scorched girl." "Yes," Eliza said, lifting her chin. "I know the town. I know where he keeps his papers. I can go where a warrior cannot." Nantan looked at her. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying mixture of pride and fear. "It is a death journey," he said. "I was dead the moment I left Red Butte." Eliza replied, "You gave me life back. Let me use it for something that matters." The council murmured. Finally, the oldest woman, Dasla, nodded once. The decision was made. The night before they were to leave, the wind turned savage. It howled down from the peaks, carrying flakes of early snow and a biting chill that seeped through the thickest buckskin. Eliza lay in her designated corner of Nantan's wickiup. She was shivering violently. Her blankets were thin, and the cold seemed to specifically target her scars. The damaged skin had no insulation, no blood flow to warm it. It felt like a block of ice was pressed against her face and neck, a burning, aching cold that made her teeth chatter. She curled into a tight ball, trying to suppress the shivers. The frame of the wickiup rattled in the wind, a lonely, desolate sound. She heard Nantan move in the darkness. He stood up, blocking the draft from the entrance flap. He walked over to where she lay. "You are freezing," he stated. I am fine," Eliza stammered, her jaw clenched. Nantan did not argue. He walked back to his sleeping furs, gathered them up, and returned. He dropped the heavy buffalo robe over her, but he did not stop there. He sat down beside her, his presence a sudden wall of radiating heat. "The cold bites the scarred skin harder," he said softly. "I know this. My arm aches when the frost comes." He hesitated for a moment, a warrior unsure of the terrain of intimacy. Then, with a decisive movement, he lifted the edge of the blankets and slid underneath them, positioning himself behind her. "Turn," he commanded gently. Eliza turned, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. She was face to face with him in the dark, the embers of the central fire providing a faint, orange glow. He pulled her close. It was not a grasp of possession, but of protection. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest, sharing the warmth of his body. He was solid, unyielding, like leaning against a warm tree. Eliza stiffened at first, her instincts screaming that this was dangerous, that men only touched women for one reason. But Nantan did not grope. He simply held her. Slowly, the shivering stopped. The warmth seeped into her bones. He shifted slightly, moving one hand to brush the hair away from her face. His fingers grazed the ridge of her scar. Eliza flinched, instinctively trying to bury her face in the blanket. "Do not," she whispered. "It is ugly in the light. It is worse in the dark. It feels like leather." Nantan caught her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were pools of obsidian, reflecting the dying fire. "Listen to me, Eliza," he said. His voice was a low rumble in his chest, vibrating against her back. "Down there, in the town, they are blind. They see a mask. They do not see the woman." He traced the line of the burn with his thumb, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "You think this makes you less?" he continued. "You think you must hide, but tonight you stood before the council of warriors and spoke with the voice of a storm. Do you think an ugly woman could do that?" I am just useful," Eliza said, a tear leaking out to track through the scar tissue. "No," Nantan said. The word was final. "You are not a tool. You are the fire that did not go out." He moved his face closer, until their foreheads were touching. His breath was warm on her skin. "They will call you names," he whispered. "They will try to make you small. But here, Every morning when the sun wakes us, I will tell you one thing. You are beautiful." Eliza let out a wet, choked laugh. "You are a terrible liar. Nantan, I have a mirror." "I am a chief," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I do not lie. I look at the heart, and your heart is the most beautiful thing I have seen in these mountains. Every morning, Eliza, until you believe it." He pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, tucking her in. "Now sleep. Tomorrow we ride into the wolf's den." Eliza closed her eyes. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart beating against her back. For the first time in 3 years, the ache in her face subsided, replaced by a warmth that bloomed from the inside out. They fell asleep like that, tangled together against the cold. Two scarred people finding a way to fit their broken pieces together. The morning came with a pale, gray light that washed out the colors of the world. The wind had died down, leaving a crisp, silent frost on the ground. Eliza woke to the smell of coffee. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Nantan was already up, crouched by the small fire, pouring dark liquid into a tin cup. He heard her move and turned. His face was stoic, his warrior mask back in place, but his eyes were soft. He handed her the cup. "Morning, beautiful," he said. It was not a throwaway line. It was said with the gravity of a prayer. Eliza froze, the cup halfway to her lips. A flush that had nothing to do with the coffee heat spread across her cheeks. She looked at him, waiting for the punchline, for the mockery. But he just watched her, steady and patient. "Morning," she whispered back, looking down into the dark liquid to hide the sudden brightness in her eyes. They moved quickly after that. There was no time for sentimentality. Nantan, Eliza, and Koche, who had insisted on coming to protect the brave one, prepared the horses. They rode down the mountain in silence, sticking to the deep ravines to avoid the skyline. By the time they reached the outskirts of Red Butte, the sun was high and punishing. They left the horses in a box canyon 2 miles out. Nantan and Koche began to apply mud to their faces, breaking up their features to blend with the shadows. Eliza pulled a heavy woolen shawl from her saddlebag. It was drab and gray, the kind worn by the old widows of the town. She wrapped it around her head, pulling the cowl forward until her face was a mystery. She hunched her shoulders, transforming her silhouette from a young woman to a bent crone. "I will go in first," Eliza said. "I need to get to the livery stable near the back of Hollister's office. Wait for my signal, a white cloth in the window." "If they catch you," Nantan started, gripping her arm. "They won't look at me?" Eliza said, her voice bitter but strong. "No one looks at a beggar woman, and if they do see the face, well, they will just see the monster they created." She walked into town on foot. The dust of Red Butte felt different now. Before, it had felt like a suffocating blanket. Now, it felt like a battlefield. She moved through the back alleys, avoiding the main boardwalk. The town was buzzing with tension. She paused near the water trough behind the general store to listen to 2 women hanging laundry. "My husband says the depot is a tinderbox," one woman said, pinning a sheet with aggressive stabs. "Bart Hollister says he saw Apache smoke signals on the ridge. Says they are planning to burn us out tonight." "Tonight?" the other woman gasped. "Lord have mercy. We have 3 barrels of oil stored there. If that goes up, we won't have light for the winter." "Hollister has his men guarding it," the first woman replied. "Thank God for that man. He is the only thing standing between us and the savages." Eliza grit her teeth. The lie had taken root deep in the soil of their fear. She made her way to the sheriff's office, which sat adjacent to Bart Hollister's private land office. The sun was dipping low, casting long, concealing shadows. The office was a 2-story wooden building. The ground floor was business. The top floor was Bart's private suite. Eliza knew from her time delivering supplies that Bart kept his safe in the back room of the ground floor, behind his heavy oak desk. She waited until she saw Clay Rourke leave the building, walking toward the saloon with a swagger that suggested he had already started drinking. Bart followed a moment later. heading toward the hotel for his dinner. The office was dark. Eliza slipped to the back door. It was locked, but it was a simple tumbler lock. She pulled a thin metal pick from her sleeve, a tool Nantan had fashioned for her from a piece of stiff wire. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced them to still listen with your skin, she reminded herself. She felt the pins click. The door creaked open. She slipped inside, the smell of cigar smoke and expensive leather hitting her instantly. It was the smell of power. She moved to the desk. It was cluttered with maps of the valley with red lines drawn through the Apache territory. She tried the drawers. Locked. She used the pick again. Click. She rifled through the papers. Deeds, cattle counts, receipts for grain. Nothing incriminating. Then, she found a false bottom in the third drawer. Her heart leaped. She pried it open with her fingernail. Inside lay a small, black, leather-bound ledger. Eliza opened it. She squinted in the dim light filtering through the dusty window. September 12th. Payment to J. Miller, $50. Barn fire. O'Malley Place, October 4th. Payment to C. Rourke, $100. Silence regarding the water poisoning. November 20th. Payment to the McCarty boys, $200. Depot job, supplies arrows, buckskins for disguise. It was all there. A meticulous record of every crime, every arson, every bribe. Bart Hollister was so arrogant, so sure of his untouchability, that he had written down his sins in black ink. Got you, Eliza whispered. She shoved the ledger into the bodice of her dress, tight against her skin. She turned to leave, her hand on the doorknob. You know, a voice drawled from the shadows of the corner. I told Bart he should buy a better lock. Eliza froze. The blood drained from her face. A match flared, illuminating the sneering, ruddy face of Clay Rourke. He was sitting in a high-backed chair in the corner, a shotgun resting across his knees. He hadn't gone to the saloon. He had been waiting. Hello, Eliza. Clay smiled, and it was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. Bart figured you might try something stupid. He said, rats always come back to the nest, and look at you. Scrawny, scarred, and right where I want you. He stood up, kicking the chair aside. He leveled the shotgun at her chest. Give me the book, he said, and maybe I will make it quick. Or maybe I will let the boys have a little fun with the scorched girl before we finish what the fire started. Eliza backed up until her hips hit the desk. She could feel the ledger pressing against her heart. She was trapped. But as she looked at Clay, she didn't feel the paralyzing terror she had felt 3 years ago in the barn. She felt the cold, hard resolve of the mountain. She wasn't just Eliza Kane anymore. She was the woman who had walked through fire, and she wasn't alone. You can have the book, Clay, she said, her voice steady. But you will have to burn me for it. Clay laughed. I was hoping you would say that. Outside, the first bell of the evening chimed. The sun was gone. The night of the fire had begun. Clay Rourke did not shoot immediately. He stood there in the dim light of the office, the shotgun barrel looking like a black tunnel aimed at Eliza's chest. The smell of kerosene and stale whiskey rolled off him in waves, a scent that triggered a violent, nauseating memory in the pit of Eliza's stomach. You look surprised. Clay slurred slightly, taking a step closer. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Did you think you could just waltz in here, take the boss's property, and ride off into the sunset with your red-skin lover? Eliza pressed her back against the heavy oak desk. The leather ledger burned against her skin beneath her bodice, a hard rectangle of truth. She measured the distance between them. 6 feet, too far to reach him. Let me go. Clay, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Bart is going to burn the town. People will die. People die every day, darlin'. Clay sneered. He lowered the shotgun slightly, confident in his control of the situation. He looked at her face, his eyes lingering on the scar tissue that glistened in the lamplight. Especially broken things like you. You know, I did you a favor that night in the barn. I tried to burn away the ugly, but some stains just do not wash out. The cruelty of his words was meant to paralyze her. to send her back to that terrified girl cowering in the straw. 3 weeks ago, it would have worked. She would have crumpled. She would have begged. But the woman standing in the office tonight had climbed the high ridges. She had learned to listen to the wind. She had been held by a man who called her a mountain. Clay saw the defiance in her eyes, and it angered him. He leaned the shotgun against the wall and drew the heavy revolver from his belt. He wanted this to be personal. He wanted to feel her fear. "You are quiet," he hissed, stepping into her personal space. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers digging into her jaw, forcing her to look up at him. "Cat got your tongue, or maybe the fire melted it too." He squeezed, his thumb pressing painfully into the scar. "No man wants to touch this," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "It is dead meat. You are a walking corpse. Eliza, I am just going to finish the job." He moved his hand to her throat, his grip tightening, cutting off her air. Eliza did not panic. In the silence of her mind, she heard Nantan's voice. "The white man walks heavy. He thinks the earth is a floor." Clay was heavy. He was arrogant. He was leaning all his weight forward, relying on his size and her assumed weakness. Eliza did not pull away. She waited for the split second when his eyes lost focus, glazed with the pleasure of hurting her. Then she moved. She did not push him. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she possessed, aiming directly for the soft vulnerability between his legs. The sound of air leaving Clay's lungs was a wet, satisfying gasp. His grip on her throat shattered instantly. His eyes bulged, and he doubled over, his instinct driving his hands to his injury. The revolver dangled loosely in his right hand. Eliza did not hesitate. Nantan had taught her, do not hesitate. Hesitation is the gap where death enters. She grabbed the barrel of the revolver, twisting it violently against the joint of Clay's thumb. He screamed, a high-pitched, strangled sound, and the gun came free. She stepped back, leveling the heavy weapon. It shook in her hands, but she aimed it at his chest. Clay fell to his knees, wheezing, his face purple. He looked up at her, shock warring with pain. You bitch! Get back!" Eliza commanded. Her voice was raw from the choking, but it was loud. Clay tried to lunge for her legs. Eliza fired. She did not shoot him. She jerked the gun to the right and pulled the trigger. The bullet smashed into the plaster wall inches from his ear, sending a spray of white dust into the air. The explosion was deafening in the small room. Clay flinched, covering his head. Eliza spun around and slammed her shoulder into the locked back door. It was held. She fired again, this time at the lock mechanism. Wood splintered. She kicked it, and the door swung open into the alley. She ran. She burst into the cool night air, gasping for breath, the revolver clutched in her hand. But as she turned the corner toward the main street, she stopped dead. The sky to the north was no longer black. It was a churning, violent orange. They were too late. The depot was burning. The fire was a living beast. It roared as it consumed the wooden structure of the storage depot, sending pillars of black smoke and sparks high into the night sky. The heat was palpable even from 3 blocks away, a physical wall that pushed against the panic of the town. Eliza holstered the gun in her sash and ran toward the chaos. People were pouring out of their homes, clad in nightshirts and hastily donned trousers. Buckets were clanking. Men were shouting orders that no one was following. "The oil!" someone screamed. "If the tanks go, the whole block goes." "It is the Apache!" a woman shrieked, pointing toward the shadows at the edge of town. I saw them on the ridge." Bart Hollister stood on the porch of the hotel, fully dressed, pointing a dramatic finger toward the darkness. "They are attacking. Get your guns. Defend the town." The mob was on the verge of turning away from the fire to hunt imaginary enemies. Then, the hoofbeats came. They did not come from a distance. They came from the darkness right at the edge of the firelight. A dozen riders burst into the illuminated square. The townspeople screamed and scattered, dropping buckets, clutching children. "Apache, Apache!" But the riders did not lose arrows. They did not scream war cries. Nantan rode at the front, his face painted with the black stripes of war. But his hands were empty of weapons. He rode straight for the burning depot. "Ropes!" he shouted in English, his voice booming over the roar of the fire. "Bring the ropes!" He threw a lariat over a burning beam that had fallen across the main doors. Trapping 2 men inside, he spurred his horse, the powerful animal digging its hooves into the dirt, dragging the flaming timber away with a shower of sparks. The townspeople froze, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. The savages were not killing. They were saving. Eliza ran into the light. She saw Coche leap from his horse, grabbing a bucket from a stunned shopkeeper. He formed a line with 2 other warriors, dousing the side of the adjacent building to prevent the fire from spreading. "Help them!" Eliza screamed, grabbing a woman by the shoulders who was staring in shock. "Do not just stand there, pass the buckets." Her voice broke the trance. The urgency of the fire overrode the prejudice of the years. A blacksmith grabbed a bucket, then a baker. Suddenly, the line was moving. Apache warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with the men who had cursed them, passing water, tearing down fences to create fire breaks. Eliza saw Nantan amidst the smoke. He had dismounted and was carrying a young girl out of the smoke-filled office of the depot manager. He handed the coughing child to her mother, then turned back to the fire without waiting for thanks. For 20 minutes, Red Butte was not a town divided by hate. It was a single organism fighting for survival. As the flames began to die down, controlled by the frantic effort, the confusion started to set in. The adrenaline faded, leaving space for questions. Bart Hollister saw the shift. He was standing near the hotel, his face pale. This was not the plan. The Apache were supposed to be the villains, not the heroes. If the town saw this, if they realized. Clay Rourke stumbled out of the alley, clutching his groin. His face twisted in agony and rage. He limped to Bart's side. "She has the book!" Clay rasped, pointing a shaking hand at Eliza, who was helping a warrior bind a burn on his arm. "She has the ledger! Bart!" Bart's eyes went wide. The color drained from his face completely. He looked at the confusion in the crowd, then at the armed mercenaries he had gathered to defend the town. "They set the fire!" Bart roared suddenly, pointing at Nantan. "Do not be fooled. They set it so they could loot the store. Look, that one is stealing flour." It was a lie, desperate and thin, but fear is a dry tinder. Some of the townspeople, exhausted and confused, looked at the warriors with renewed suspicion. "Kill them!" Bart screamed. "Before they kill us all, chase them down." The mercenaries, paid well for this moment, raised their rifles. Eliza saw the shift. She saw the hands tightening on gun stocks. "Nantan!" She screamed. "It is a trap, go!" Nantan looked up. He saw the betrayal forming in the eyes of the mob. He let out a sharp whistle. The warriors mounted with fluid grace. They did not attack. They turned their horses. "Ride," Nantan commanded. He swung onto his horse and reached down. Eliza was already running. He gripped her forearm, and with a strength that felt like flying, he pulled her up behind him. "To the gorge!" Eliza shouted into his ear over the wind. "Take them to Crow's Gorge. It is the only way." Nantan hesitated for a fraction of a second. The gorge was a dead end unless one knew the goat paths, but he trusted her. He kicked his horse into a gallop. The Apache band thundered out of town, heading for the black maw of the mountains. Behind them, Bart Hollister mounted his own horse. "After them, $500 to the man who brings me the head of the scorched girl. Do not let them speak." The chase was a nightmare of dust and moonlight. The horses breathed in heavy, heaving gasps as they climbed the rise toward the canyon. Bullets whizzed past them like angry hornets, sparking off the rocks. Eliza clung to Nantan's waist. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the controlled power of the animal beneath them. She looked back. Bart, Clay, and 20 hired guns were gaining. Their horses were fresh, while the Apache ponies were tired from the ride down and the firefighting. "They are too close," Nantan shouted. "The gorge narrows," Eliza yelled back. "Up ahead, the split rock." They thundered into Crow's Gorge. The walls of the canyon shot up on either side, vertical slabs of granite that blotted out the moon. It was a place of shadows and echoes. "Spread out," Nantan signaled to his men. The warriors peeled off, guiding their horses up steep scree slopes that looked impossible to climb. They disappeared into the shadows of the rim. Nantan did not climb. He stayed on the canyon floor, riding openly. He was the bait, and Eliza was the lure. They reached the dead end, a sheer wall of rock where a dried waterfall once flowed. Nantan spun the horse around. Bart and his men rounded the bend. They saw their prey trapped. They slowed, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. "Nowhere to run, Chief," Bart shouted, his voice triumphant. He rode forward, flanked by Clay and the mercenaries. "End of the line." Clay was pale, leaning heavily on his saddle horn, but his eyes were burning with hate. He raised a rifle. "I want the girl." Clay spat. "Leave the girl for me." Bart nodded. "Kill the Indian. Grab the girl." Nantan sat motionless. He felt Eliza stiffen against his back. He reached back and touched her hand for a brief second. A silent reassurance. Then he raised his hand. From the darkness above, a sound like falling rain began. But it was not raining. Arrows. They struck the ground in a perfect line in front of Bart's horse. A warning. "Ambush," one of the mercenaries yelled, his horse rearing. "Hold your ground," Bart screamed. "They are just scare tactics. Shoot him." The canyon erupted. Warriors appeared on the rim, silhouettes against the stars. They did not fire into the mass of men. They fired at the rocks above them. Landslide. Boulders the size of anvils crashed down behind the mercenaries, blocking the exit. Dust billowed up, choking and thick. The trap was sprung. The mercenaries panicked. They were hired to shoot farmers, not to fight ghosts in a stone box. They began to scramble for cover. "Cowards!" Bart roared. He pulled his own repeater rifle. "Kill him!" Clay Rourke saw his chance. While the others looked up, he looked only at Nantan. He raised his rifle, aiming not at the warrior's chest, but at his head. Eliza saw the barrel align. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the moonlight glint on the metal. She saw Nantan reaching for his bow, but he would be too slow. Clay had the drop. A memory flashed in Eliza's mind. The barn, the heat. Her father was shouting, and she standing frozen, screaming silently, doing nothing while her world burned. Not this time. She did not freeze. She did not scream. She pulled the heavy revolver from her sash. She did not aim with her eye. She aimed with her heart, with the weight of the iron in her hand, with the rage of 3 years of silence. She pulled the trigger. The gun kicked hard, bruising her palm. Clay Rourke jerked as if pulled by an invisible wire. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. His rifle discharged into the dirt. He fell from his saddle, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He did not move. Eliza stared at the smoking gun. She had done it. She had broken the paralysis, but the fight was not over. Bart Hollister saw Clay fall. He saw the walls closing in. He realized his empire was crumbling in this dusty canyon. With a roar of pure animal fury, he charged. He did not shoot. He spurred his massive black stallion straight at Nantan, intending to trample them. "Jump!" Nantan shouted. He shoved Eliza off the horse, toward the shelter of a boulder. He spun his mount, but Bart was too close. The horses collided with a sickening crack of bone. Both men went down. Nantan hit the ground rolling, his knife already in his hand. Bart crashed into the dust, losing his rifle. He scrambled up, drawing a long Bowie knife from his belt. They circled each other in the moonlight. Bart was bigger, heavier, fueled by desperation. Nantan was quick, wounded from the fall, but fighting for his home. "I will gut you, savage!" Bart lunged. Nantan sidestepped, slashing Bart's arm. Bart grunted but used his momentum to tackle Nantan. They hit the dirt, a tangle of limbs and steel. Bart was on top, pressing the knife down toward Nantan's throat. Eliza scrambled up from the rocks. She raised the revolver again, but she couldn't shoot. They were too close. She might hit Nantan. "Nantan!" she screamed. Bart looked up at the sound of her voice for a split second. That was all Nantan needed. He bucked his hips, throwing the larger man off balance. He drove his knee into Bart's side and rolled, reversing their positions. Nantan did not stab. He slammed the pommel of his knife into Bart's temple. Crack. Bart Hollister went limp. The canyon fell silent. The dust began to settle. The mercenaries, seeing their boss unconscious and their exit blocked by rocks, threw down their guns. They raised their hands. Nantan stood up slowly, breathing hard. He looked at the unconscious Bart, then at the fallen Clay, and finally at the warriors watching from the rim. He turned to Eliza. She was standing 10 feet away, the gun still in her hand, her chest heaving. Her shawl had fallen back, revealing her face. In the moonlight, the scar looked silver. She looked at Clay's body, then at Nantan. "Is he dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nantan walked over to Clay. He checked the pulse. "He lives, but he will not hold a gun for a long time." He walked to Eliza. He gently took the revolver from her hand. "You shot true," he said softly. "I could not watch you die." Eliza whispered, "I could not watch another fire." Nantan holstered the gun. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold and shaking. He warmed them between his own hands. "You did not watch," he said. "You acted. The fire is out. Eliza." From the blocked entrance of the canyon, sounds of more horses approached. The townspeople, the sheriff, the skepticism. Nantan looked at the bound mercenaries and the unconscious Bart. "Now," he said, his voice hard with command, "we give them the truth, whether they want it or not." Eliza touched the ledger beneath her dress. "I have it. I am ready." The adrenaline of the battle began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But as Eliza stood there in the dark canyon, next to the Apache chief, she realized something profound. The shame was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was the truth. For the first time in her life, she was holding the pen. The morning sun that rose over Red Butte was not the harsh, judging glare that Eliza Kane was used to. It was a pale, tentative light, filtering through the haze of smoke that still hung low over the rooftops. The fire at the depot had been extinguished, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of timber and the smell of wet ash. But the town itself was still standing. The community hall, a sturdy building that served as both a church on Sundays and a courthouse when the circuit judge rode through, was packed to the rafters. Every bench was filled. Men stood along the back walls, their hats in their hands, their faces smeared with soot from the night's bucket brigade. Women sat with their children, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting toward the front of the room. The air inside was thick with tension, smelling of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and fear. At the front of the room, 2 tables had been set up. At one sat Bart Hollister. His hands were bound behind his back with a rough hemp rope, but he sat with his spine straight and his chin high, wearing his arrogance like a suit of armor. Beside him, lying on a makeshift stretcher, was Clay Rourke. The former deputy was pale, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his breathing ragged and shallow. At the judge's bench sat Judge Holloway, a man with a face like a dried apple, and eyes that had seen every variation of humans in the territory had to offer. Beside him stood Captain Miller of the 4th Cavalry, who had ridden in at dawn with a patrol. Alerted by the smoke and the rumors of an uprising, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked open. Silence swept through the room like a cold wind. Eliza Kane walked in. She wore the same dust-stained dress she had worn in the canyon. She had washed the mud from her face, but she had made a conscious choice not to wear the scarf. The scar on her neck and cheek was exposed, a map of pink and white ridges against her pale skin. Behind her walked Nantan. He was not bound. He carried no weapons, but his presence was lethal enough. He wore his buckskins and the black paint of war still streaked his cheekbones. He walked a step behind Eliza, not as a servant, but as a guard. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. "It is him," a woman whispered. "The wolf of the Dragoon Mountains. Look at her face," a man muttered. "God, it is hard to look at." Eliza heard them. For 3 years, Those whispers had made her shrink, made her hide, made her wish she had died in the flames with her father. Today, they just sounded like dry leaves blowing across the ground. She walked straight down the center aisle. She did not lower her head. She looked left, meeting the eyes of the baker. She looked right, meeting the eyes of the blacksmith. She forced them to acknowledge her, scar and all. She took her place at the empty table opposite Bart. Nantan stood behind her chair, his arms crossed, his dark eyes scanning the room, missing nothing. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Order," the judge croaked. "We are here to sort out the events of last night. I'm told there was a fire. I'm told there was a fight in Crow's Gorge, and I see the wealthiest man in the valley in chains." He looked over his spectacles at Eliza. "And I see Miss Kane has returned from the dead, in the company of the very Apache we have been hunting." Bart Hollister stood up before he was called. He flashed a charming, incredulous smile at the crowd. "Your Honor," Bart said, his voice smooth and projecting to the back of the room. "This is a farce. I demand to be untied. Last night, my men and I were defending this town from a savage attack. We chased the arsonists into the canyon, where we were ambushed." He gestured with his head toward Nantan. "That man is a killer. He and his band set the fire to the depot to distract us while they looted the stores. And that woman—" Bart turned his cold blue eyes on Eliza. He shook his head with a performance of pity. "Poor Eliza. We all know she has not been right in the head since the tragedy. The fire took her father, and it took her mind. She has been living like a hermit, eaten up by guilt because she knows, and we all know, that she was the one who knocked that lantern over 3 years ago." The crowd murmured in agreement. It was the story they knew. It was the story that made sense. "She is mentally unstable, Your Honor," Bart continued, pressing his advantage. "She wandered into the hills and fell in with this tribe. They have used her. They twisted her broken mind against her own people. She led them here. She helped them burn the depot just like she burned her own barn." "Liar!" Nantan's voice cut through the air. It was deep and resonant, startling the room. "Silence!" the judge roared. "The Indian will speak when spoken to." Captain Miller stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber. "Mr." Hollister makes a compelling point. "Judge, my scouts found arrows at the scene of the fire. Apache arrows." Bart nodded smugly. "There you have it. Proof." Eliza stood up. Her legs felt weak, but her hands, resting on the table, were steady. She felt Nantan's presence behind her, a pillar of heat and strength. "You are the mountain," she thought. "Eliza Kane," the judge said, "you have been accused of conspiracy to commit arson and treason against the territory. What do you say?" Eliza looked at Bart. Then she looked at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Gable, who had pulled her children away from Eliza in the street. She saw Mr. Henderson, who had lied about the sugar. "I say," Eliza began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its rhythm, "that Bart Hollister thinks you are all fools." A gasp went through the room. "He thinks he can burn your food and fuel, and you will thank him for it." Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger. "He thinks he can kill your neighbors, and you will applaud him." "Objection," Bart shouted. "She is raving." "Sit down, Mr. Hollister," the judge snapped. "Let her speak." Eliza reached into the bodice of her dress. She pulled out the black leather ledger. It was battered and dusty, but it was intact. "You want to talk about the fire 3 years ago?" Eliza asked, looking directly at Clay Rourke, who was watching her with glazed, feverish eyes. "Let us talk about it. It was not an accident, and it was not me." She opened the book. She did not look at the pages. She knew them by heart now. November 4th, 1875. She read, "Payment to Clay Rourke, $50. Purpose silence regarding the Kane incident." She looked up. "Clay Rourke came to our barn that night drunk. He demanded money. My father refused. Clay threw the lantern. He stood there and watched my father burn. And then he took $50 from Bart Hollister to make sure the report said it was an accident." "That is a lie," Bart yelled. straining against his ropes. "That book is a forgery." Eliza ignored him. She turned the pages, her finger tracing the lines of ink. "August 12th, this year," she read. "Payment to the McCarty brothers, $200. Purpose harassment of the Miller Ranch, cutting fences, poisoning the well." She looked at a man in the second row. "Mr. Miller, did you not sell your land to Bart 2 weeks later for half its value because you had no water?" Mr. Miller stood up slowly, his face turning red. I did. The well went dry overnight. It smelled of lye." "It was lye," Eliza said. "Paid for by Bart." She turned another page. "September 2nd. Payment to mercenaries, $100. Purpose shoot 5 heads of cattle on the Grand Ridge. Insert Apache arrows post-mortem." She looked at Captain Miller. "Captain, you found those cows. Did you not? You wrote a report to your superiors about Apache raiding parties breaking the treaty." The captain's face hardened. He looked from the book to Bart Hollister. "I did write that report." Eliza slammed the book shut. The sound echoed in the hall. "And last night," she said, her voice ringing with accusation. "There is no entry yet, but I heard them. I was in the canyon when they planned it. Bart said, 'Burn the depot, blame the Apache. The army will clear them out, and the land will be mine.'" She walked around the table and stood in front of the crowd. "He brought hired guns to kill me because I heard him. He tried to kill me in the gorge. If Nantan and his men had not saved me, if they had not come down to save you and put out the fire that Bart started, the depot would be ash, and I would be dead." The room was in chaos. People were shouting, pointing fingers. The narrative they had believed for years was unraveling. "She is lying," Bart screamed, his face purple. "She is a witch. Look at her face. She is marked by the devil." "Captain Miller," Judge Holloway said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Examine that book." Eliza handed the ledger to the captain. He leafed through it, his expression growing darker with every page. "This is Hollister's handwriting," the captain said. "I have seen his letters, and these signatures. Some of these men are known outlaws." The judge turned his gaze to the stretcher. "Clay Rourke." Clay groaned. He tried to shift, but the pain pinned him down. "You are a sworn officer of the law," the judge said sternly. "You are also a dying man, by the looks of it. Do not meet your maker with a lie on your lips. Is the girl telling the truth?" Clay looked up. He looked at Bart, who was staring at him with a mixture of pleading and threat. Then he looked at Eliza. He looked at the scar he had given her. He let out a wheezing cough that brought blood to his lips. Clay rasped. His voice was barely a whisper. The room fell silent to hear him. "He told me to throw the lamp." Bart closed his eyes. "And the depot," the judge pressed. "We set it," Clay whispered. "Bart wanted the land. We set the fire, and we yelled Apache. It was all a show." Clay's head fell back against the pillow, exhausted. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Bart Hollister slumped in his chair. The arrogance evaporated, leaving only a small, greedy man caught in his own web. Judge Holloway stood up. He adjusted his spectacles, his hands shaking slightly with rage. "Captain Miller," the judge said, "take Mr. Hollister into custody. The charges are arson, conspiracy, attempted murder, and murder in the first degree regarding Mr. Kane. I want him transported to the territorial prison in Yuma immediately." "Yes, sir," Captain Miller said. He gestured to his soldiers, who moved in to haul Bart to his feet. "And, Captain," the judge added, "send a telegram to Fort Grant. Tell the general that the campaign against Nantan's band is suspended indefinitely, pending a full investigation into the instigation of hostilities." "Understood," the captain said. He looked at Nantan and gave a stiff, formal nod. Nantan returned it, a warrior acknowledging a warrior, as the soldiers dragged Bart away, shouting obscenities. The crowd turned back to Eliza. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of shame. Mr. Henderson, the storekeep, looked at his boots. Mrs. Gable clutched her shawl. looking pale. They had mocked her. They had shunned her. They had believed the worst of her because it was easier than facing the darkness in their own town. Eliza stood at the front of the room. She felt Nantan's hand touch her shoulder lightly, a silent anchor. She looked at them. She looked at the faces that had been her tormentors for 3 years. "You are staring," Eliza said softly. No one looked away. "You have always stared," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet power. "You called me scorched girl. You told your children I was a monster. You thought the fire on my face meant I was broken inside." She raised her hand and touched the ridged skin of her cheek. She did not flinch. "Bart Hollister used your fear. He used your hate. He told you the Apache were monsters so he could steal from you. He told you I was a monster so he could hide his crime." She paused, looking directly at the young mother who had protected her child the day before. "This scar," Eliza said, "is not a mark of shame. It is a memory. It reminds me that I survived the fire you all ignored. It reminds me that while you were safe in your beds, hating what you did not understand, I was walking through the flames to find the truth." She took a breath, and for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. Not pretty prettiness was for dolls. She felt beautiful like the canyon walls, carved by wind and time. "I will not hide it anymore," she said. "And I will not be silent anymore, because the only thing that burns worse than fire is the lie you tell yourself to stay comfortable." She turned to Nantan. "I am ready to go home, not to the shack," Nantan said quietly, loud enough for the front row to hear. "To the bridge." Eliza smiled. It was a tired smile, but it reached her eyes. She walked out of the hall, Nantan at her side. The crowd parted for them. As she passed, "Mr." Henderson took a step forward. "Miss Kane," he stammered. I have that sugar, if you need it." Eliza stopped. She looked at him. "Keep it, Mr. Henderson," she said. "I find I have lost my taste for sweet things. I prefer the truth now." She walked out into the sunlight. The air was clear. The smoke was gone. And for the first time, the town of Red Butte looked small behind her, while the mountains ahead looked like open arms. The seasons in the Arizona Territory did not change with a whisper. They changed with a shift in the wind. The biting cold of the winter that had frozen the water troughs in Red Butte finally retreated, replaced by the wild, erratic gusts of spring that brought the scent of sagebrush and wet earth down from the mountains. 6 months had passed since the trial in the community hall. 6 months since the ledger had been opened and the truth had spilled out like blood from a wound. Red Butte was not a new town overnight. Prejudice was a sturdy weed, deep-rooted and difficult to pull. There were still men who spat on the ground when an Apache rode past the perimeter markers. There were still women who crossed the street to avoid walking in the shadow of a savage. But the fear, the blinding, hysterical terror that Bart Hollister had cultivated like a poisonous crop was gone. The change was in the details. It was in the way the new sheriff, a quiet man named Miller, no relation to the captain, looked the other way when Apache hunters tracked elk into the lower valley. It was in the way the general store began stocking beads and thick wool blankets, items requested specifically for trade. The revenge raids that had been a staple of Saturday night whiskey talk were canceled, not by law, but by a lack of volunteers. It was hard to rouse a mob to kill the people who had saved the town from burning. The cognitive dissonance was too great, even for the most hardened bigot. And in the middle of this fragile, shifting landscape stood a small cabin. It was not in the town, where the buildings clustered together for safety. And it was not in the high stronghold of the Dragoon Mountains, where the air was thin and sharp. It sat on a rise in the foothills, exactly halfway between the two worlds. Eliza Kane had built it. Not alone, never alone anymore, but the design was hers. It was a structure of rough-hewn pine and river stone, sturdy enough to withstand the wind and open enough to welcome it. She had refused to return to her old shack at the edge of town. That place belonged to the Scorched Girl, and the Scorched Girl was a ghost. This new home belonged to Eliza. On a Tuesday morning, the air was crisp and smelled of pine resin. Eliza stood on the porch, watching a wagon rumble up the trail. It was Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper. Beside him sat his wife, clutching a basket of eggs. Waiting on the porch with Eliza was Apache, the tall Apache warrior who had once wanted to kill her. Now, he leaned against the railing, whittling a piece of ironwood, looking bored but attentive. "Morning, Miss Kane," Mr. Henderson called out. Pulling the mules to a halt, he nodded stiffly at Kocha. "Morning." Kochi nodded back. A microscopic movement. "Henderson?" "We brought the flour," Henderson said, climbing down. "And the wife sent some of her pickled beets. For the trade." Eliza stepped forward. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, the sleeves rolled up for work. Her hair was pulled back, and the morning sun struck the left side of her face fully. The scar was there, vivid and undeniable, but she did not turn her head. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Eliza said. "The tribe has brought the hides you asked for. 3 buckskins, cured the old way, soft as water." She gestured to a pile of golden brown leather stacked on a bench. The exchange was awkward, filled with silences where insults used to be, misses. Henderson wouldn't look Coach in the eye, and Coach wouldn't look at the wagon. But the goods changed hands. Flour for leather, pickled beets for medicinal sage. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was commerce. And in the West, commerce was the grandfather of peace. As the Hendersons drove away, Eliza sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "They smell like fear," Kochi commented in his own language, which Eliza was slowly beginning to understand. "They smell like pickled beets," Eliza replied in English, making Kochi snort with a rare, dry amusement. This was her life now. She was the bridge. She was the translator of intent. She wrote down the agreements. She smoothed over the cultural insults. She ensured that the peace held, 1 sack of flour at a time. But her favorite time was not the day of trade. It was dawn, every morning, before the sun crested the peaks, when the sky was a bruised purple fading to gold. Eliza would wake. She would light the stove and brew coffee strong, black and bitter, the way Nantan liked it. She would pour 2 cups and walk out to the porch. He was usually already there. Nantan did not live in the cabin. He was a chief. His place was with his people in the stronghold. But he was a man who rode fast horses, and the distance between the village and the cabin seemed to shrink with every passing week. On this particular morning, the mist was clinging to the valley floor. Nantan was leaning against the support post, looking out toward the horizon. He wore a heavy buffalo coat against the chill, his hair loose around his shoulders. He heard her footsteps, light on the wooden planks. He turned. His face was weathering like the mountains he loved. There were new lines around his eyes, lines of responsibility, but the hardness that had defined him during the war had softened. Just a fraction. He took the cup from her hand. His fingers brushed hers warm, rough, electric. He took a sip, grimaced appreciatively at the strength of the brew, and then looked at her. He did not look at her dress. He did not look at her hair. He looked straight at the scar that melted her cheek and neck. He studied it as he did every morning, as if checking to make sure she was still the woman who had walked through fire. "Morning, beautiful," he said. His voice was a low rumble, gravel and honey. 6 months ago, those words had made Eliza flinch. They had felt like a cruel joke or a pitiful lie. She had hidden her face, blushed, turned away. Today, she stood her ground. She took a sip of her own coffee and arched an eyebrow. "Morning, grumpy chief," she replied. Nantan's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I am not grumpy. I am contemplative. You are contemplating how much you hate the taste of Mr. Henderson's coffee." Eliza teased. "It tastes like mud from a river bottom?" Nantan agreed. "But the company is acceptable." "Is this acceptable?" "Superior," he corrected, a small smile playing on his lips. "It is superior." Eliza leaned back against the wall, watching him. The ritual was simple, but it was the anchor of her world. Morning, beautiful. He said it until the words wore a groove in her mind, replacing the old tapes of scorched girl and monster. It wasn't that the scar had faded. It was still pink, still tight, still pulled to the corner of her mouth. But Nantan didn't look past it. He didn't ignore it to be polite. He looked at it and saw the beauty of survival. And because he did, Eliza had learned to look in the mirror and see the same thing. "The children are coming today," Eliza said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes," Nantan said. "Dasla has prepared a story about the coyote and the stars. She is worried the white children will not understand the humor." "They will understand," Eliza said. "Laughter is the same in every language." By noon, the cabin had transformed. The main room, with its large fireplace and sturdy table, had become a schoolhouse. But it was unlike any schoolhouse in the territory. On one side of the rug sat 7 Apache children, their eyes bright and attentive. On the other side sat 4 children from Red Butte, the baker's 2 sons, the blacksmith's daughter, and a shy boy whose father was a miner. It had taken 3 months of negotiation to get the town parents to agree to this. It had Eliza standing in the general store, arguing that if the town wanted to survive, the next generation had to understand their neighbors. It had taken the pragmatic realization that knowing the Apache language was a valuable trade skill. Eliza stood at the front, holding a slate. "Tree," she said clearly. She wrote the word tree in block letters. "In Apache." A little girl named Sani raised her hand. "Tsa." "Good." Eliza smiled. She looked at the miner's son. "Tommy, can you say tsa?" Tommy shifted in his seat, looking at the Apache girl. He took a breath. "Tsa," Sani giggled, but it wasn't malicious. She corrected his pronunciation with a series of clicks and breaths. Tommy tried again. They laughed together. In the corner, sitting in a rocking chair that looked too small for her, was Dasla. The old woman watched the proceedings with a critical eye, occasionally muttering corrections to Eliza's own pronunciation. Nantan stood outside, leaning by the open window. He wasn't participating, that would be beneath the dignity of a war chief in a room of children, but he was listening. He watched Eliza moving between the groups. She touched a shoulder here, ruffled hair there. She was radiant. Not in the porcelain doll way of the women in the fashion magazines Bart Hollister used to leave lying around, but in the way a wildfire is radiant. She was alive. She was fierce. She was kind. He remembered the woman he had pulled from the ravine 6 months ago, shivering, broken, expecting death. He looked at her now, commanding the room, bridging 2 hostile cultures with nothing but a slate board and stubbornness. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with war. It was a feeling of settling, of arrival. The lesson ended with Dasla telling her story. Eliza translated, stumbling occasionally, which made the children laugh. But as the story of the coyote trying to steal a star unfolded, the room went quiet. The white children and the Apache children leaned in, their mouths open, united by the universal magic of once upon a time. When the parents arrived to pick up the town children, the tension was still there, but it was thinner. The blacksmith nodded to Nantan on the porch. Nantan nodded back. A small gesture, but a mountain is climbed 1 step at a time. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the scrubland, the cabin grew quiet again. Eliza sat at her desk, organizing the ledgers. She kept 2 books now, one for the trade agreements, and one for herself, a journal. She thought about the news that had come via telegram the day before. Bart Hollister had been sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. The judge had been unforgiving. Bart's empire was being broken up and sold off to pay restitution to the families he had cheated. The great cattle king was now just a number in a stone cell, and Clay Rourke. Clay was back in town, living in a room behind the saloon. He was a cripple, his shoulders shattered by Eliza's bullet, his hand useless. He spent his days drinking cheap whiskey and telling anyone who would listen that he was a victim, but no one listened. He had become a ghost in his own life, haunting the boardwalks, a living warning that the truth eventually finds everyone. Eliza dipped her pen in the ink. She wrote, Justice is not a straight line. Sometimes it is a circle. What you put out comes back. She closed the book and stood up. She caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging by the door. She stopped. For years, mirrors had been her enemy. She had draped cloth over them. She had looked at them only in the dark. Now, she stepped closer. She traced the line of the scar with her fingertip. It was silver in the evening light. It twisted the skin of her neck. It was not pretty. "Survivor," she whispered to the glass. "Witness?" She saw the eyes of the woman in the mirror. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of someone who had stared down a corrupt lawman, who had ridden into a box canyon, who had spoken truth to power. The scar was just the cover of the book. The story inside was what mattered. The evening wind picked up, cooling the desert floor. Eliza wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, a colorful woolen one Nantan had given her, woven with the patterns of the 4 directions, and went out to the back porch. Nantan was there, tending a small fire in the stone pit they had built. He was roasting a rabbit for their dinner. The domesticity of the scene struck Eliza. A white woman and an Apache chief, sharing a fire in the borderlands. It was dangerous. It was scandalous. It was perfect. She sat down on the step next to him. He cut a piece of the meat and handed it to her on the tip of his knife. She took it without hesitation. They ate in silence, watching the stars emerge. The Milky Way was a bright slash across the heavens, a river of light that made the politics of the earth seem very small. "The soldiers are leaving Fort Grant," Nantan said quietly. "Only a skeleton crew remains. They say there is no need for a campaign." "Because there is no war," Eliza said. "Bart created the war." "Bart struck the match," Nantan corrected. "But the dry grass was already there. Hate is dry grass. You have brought rain, Eliza." "We brought rain," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The buckskin of his shirt was soft against her cheek. "I would still be hiding in my shack if you hadn't found me." She looked up at the stars. "I think about that day in the ravine, when I was lying there, waiting for Clay to kill me. I felt so heavy, like I was already buried." She turned her head to look at his profile, the strong nose, the high forehead, the scar on his own chin. "If you hadn't pulled me up from the rocks," she trailed off. Nantan turned to look at her. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, softening the warrior's gaze into something infinitely tender. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering on the scarred skin of her neck. His thumb brushed the pulse that beat there, strong and steady. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and certain. "You think I saved you, but you are wrong. I was helpless," she argued gently. "You were wounded," Nantan said, "but you were not helpless. A helpless thing dies in the fire. A helpless thing breaks when the world strikes it." He took her hand and placed it over her own heart. "You walked through the fire that took your father. You walked through the fire of the town's hate for 3 years. You walked into my village when you thought we were monsters. You walked into that courtroom." He squeezed her hand. "On that day in the ravine, you did not need me to give you a soul. You already had one of iron. You pulled yourself up from the fire a long time ago. Eliza, I just reached out the second time to make sure you did not fall back in." Eliza felt a tear track hot down her cheek. It crossed the scar, a river running over dry ground. "You stayed," she whispered. "Everyone else ran. You stayed." "I am a man of the mountains," Nantan said, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "We do not run from the storm. We built our house in it." He kissed her then. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or tragic farewells. It was a slow, deliberate claim. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the promise of tomorrow. When they pulled apart, the night was silent around them, but it was not the empty, terrifying silence of the desert she had known before. It was a total silence. It was the silence of a house that had settled, the silence of a peace that had been fought for and won. Eliza Kane, the scorched girl, rested her head on the shoulder of the Apache chief. Above them, The stars wheeled in their ancient courses, indifferent to the scars of the world below, shining equally on the town, the stronghold, and the small wooden house that stood bravely between them. She closed her eyes and listened. She didn't hear the fire anymore. She only heard the beating of two hearts, steady and strong, in the quiet dark. Thank you so much for journeying with me through the dusty trails of Red Butte and the healing heart of Eliza Kane. Stories like this about finding beauty in our scars and bridges in our divides are the ones I love telling the most. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a busy city, dreaming of the open range, or somewhere quiet like Eliza's cabin? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Eliza and Nantan's ending. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and hitting that like button. If you really enjoyed it, smashing that hype button helps these stories reach more people who might need a reminder that they are beautiful, scars and all. Thank you for listening, and until the next campfire,